Good evening, you're watching No Spin. I'm Nidhi Razdan. It is week 2 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. By now, Moscow expected that the country would be in their complete control, but the Ukrainians have put up an unexpected resistance. Nevertheless, over the last 72 hours, the Russians have made significant advances and control key parts of the country now. However, the capital Kyiv is still standing. Meanwhile, the diplomatic dilemma continues for Delhi. Last night, India abstained again during a UN General Assembly vote that overwhelmingly condemned Russia. This evening, leaders of the Quad alliance, that's India, the United States, Japan and Australia, are meeting. India is the only country in that grouping that has not condemned Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. The question is, how long can India sit on the fence? We'll be looking at that in some detail in just a moment. But first, to give you a sense of just how the Russians have advanced on day 8 of their invasion of the country. This map will give you a sense, and these pictures of how things have progressed. At the moment, Russia has captured several parts of the country. That also includes a major port city known as Kherson, which experts say could actually cut off essential supplies to other parts of Ukraine now that it is in Russian control. Major explosions have been heard in the capital Kyiv, which is still under Ukrainian control. Large parts of the north, east and south have been captured by Russian forces. Russia says they've lost 500 soldiers. Ukraine says that thousands of civilians have been killed as a result of the Russian aggression. Well, my colleague Vishnu Shom managed to get into Ukraine this morning, doing a trek through the border with Poland. And Vishnu, you are in the city Lviv in western Ukraine. What's happening there today, Vishnu?
Well, I can tell you that contrary to these images of normalcy which you actually see around you, there's a fair bit of tension over here. Earlier on the day, I was in some bomb shelters. There are people making Molotov cocktails. There are children in shelters which have actually been set up as well. This is the last remaining major, entirely functioning Ukrainian city at this stage. It is, in a sense, one of the few areas which have not really been bombed or hit. There are air raids, warnings, sirens which actually go off. But make no mistake about it, people over here are worried. They know exactly what is happening in other parts of the country, and they are waiting for any ominous signs. Hopefully that will not happen. This is also the city where several missions, including the Indian embassy, have pulled back to. They've opened up over here to try and ensure that those very important diplomatic links with Ukraine do remain at this stage. I can tell you, getting into this part of Ukraine has been extremely difficult. Crossing over from Poland into the Ukrainian side, there are lots of questions. There are barricades every few kilometers. An excessive presence, as you would expect, of soldiers and police. But we are here in Lviv trying to bring you the story, not just of this city, but indeed of areas across Ukraine. Nidhi.
Right. Vishnu, just on the question of Indian nationals who are trying to get out of there now, the Ministry of External Affairs said today that 18,000 Indians who live in Ukraine have managed to get out. What does that mean in terms of how many are still left there? I know the original number was pegged at about 20,000. And you mentioned you went through Poland. There have been a large number of Indians who've been trying to get out from these border crossings.
That's right. Now, those numbers have come down sharply today. As you mentioned, of those 20,000, approximately 18,000 have already left. Not all of them were evacuated. A few of them had left. Quite a few of them had left earlier on as well. But at this stage, what is the status of those remaining 2,000 odd Indian nationals? I do know that the embassy over here, which is now based out of Lviv, is trying to ensure that the situation is sort of taken care of, that they identify where those students are and they progressively come here. But the number of lines and the number of groups of Indian nationals, we're in fact just told by security to move the camera off the angle of our camera. That's a bit of a concern. Nobody really knows where these Indian nationals are. Presumably the government of India does have some idea. And those students and Indian nationals in other parts of the country, when they do eventually come here, then they make it relatively easier to actually move across the border and enter Poland. The trick, the difficulty, the challenge, this is where Indians don't really have that much support, is getting Indian nationals from the areas in the east or the south, bringing them over here or to some of the other border areas and evacuating them from there. That's the challenge, where Indian nationals have very little, if any, support.
Vishnu Shom, thanks very much for joining us. Please do take care, you and our colleague Kadambini, who is traveling with you in Ukraine. Thanks very much for that update. Well, I'll go across first to Lieutenant General D.S. Huda, the former Northern Army commander, strategic affairs analyst, joining us this evening to give us a sense of how things are unfolding in Russia and in Ukraine. General Huda, firstly, would you say that the resistance put up by the Ukrainian forces has been somewhat unexpected?
Absolutely, Nidhi. I don't think, the Russians expected so much resistance from Ukraine. I think what they were looking at is, if you could pressurize Ukraine at minimum cost by not launching, very large-scale military operations. And that's why in the initial stages, you did not see the use of, massive air power from the Russian side. So I think they were thinking that, Ukraine will fold, and their aim of the change of government would take place just by sort of posturing with their military forces. Now that it has not happened, I fear that, this is the time that they'll now actually increase, and we are seeing, increase in use of air power, increase in artillery bombardments, attempt to capture large cities. So I think we are in for, at least as far as Ukraine is concerned, for some very difficult days ahead.
In fact, there was a phone call today between President Macron of France and President Putin. And after that, General Huda, the French government said that the French president's assessment is that the worst is yet to come for Ukraine. And that echoes what you're saying. And we've seen that, as you mentioned, the last couple of days, with the Russians stepping up their attacks on civilian areas in particular. So are the next 48 to 72 hours really going to determine which way this goes now?
Absolutely, Nidhi, because I think for the Russians, the capital is the key. If they're able to capture the capital, and frankly, it's not going to be easy. There is going to be resistance from the Ukrainian side. But certainly, I see the Russians sort of ramping up their offensive, ramping up the scale of attacks and bombardment that they're doing. So certainly, as you said, the next 48 to 72 hours are going to be very critical.
We've, of course, been focusing a lot on the Indian nationals stranded there and who've been trying to get out. And thankfully, most do seem to have made it out. But there are still hundreds of students in particular who are stuck in Ukraine. I saw this evening that the Ministry of Defense here put out some advisories on what Indians can do in order to navigate their way through a war zone like this, including learning some very basic Russian words, describing to those that they meet who they are, etc. What would your advice be to people who are trying to walk or just find any means to get to a safer place?
See, Nidhi, I think anybody who's caught in the sort of conflict zone must move out from there. I mean, that's the first basic thing. And, move out with whatever little you can, ultimately depend on the fact that you might have to walk on foot, and therefore take minimum things with you. Try and keep, people informed of where you are. Move out in groups. Don't try and break out on your own. It's unfortunate that, people are stuck in this and, innocent students from India. But I think the earlier they make a decision that they need to move out from there, whatever be the difficulty, I think it'll be more challenging if you are caught in a conflict zone than if you're out of it. So that would be my sort of advice.
Finally, General Huda, how concerned are you, given India's own problems with China at the LAC, that this entire scenario might be pushing the Russians even closer to China? How does that complicate things for us?
So, Nidhi, the fact that China was and Russia were moving closer together is not something that is new. So, I mean, it's been happening. And certainly, as this conflict unfolds, and we've seen the kind of statements that have come out from China saying they're not supporting sanctions that have been given by the Western countries. So you will see Russia and China moving closer together. And that is something that we have to contend with in the future. Nidhi, at the end of the day, I think, countries will have to depend on themselves to navigate this very, very uncertain sort of geopolitical space. And so now India has to see, with these changed circumstances, with Russia, China moving closer together, with our problems with China on the LAC. As I said, I think ultimately we'll have to depend on our own and see how we need to, tackle these challenges that will come in the future.
All right, General Huda, thank you very much, sir. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for giving us some perspective on this war and the larger implications for India, certainly. Now, amid this crisis in Ukraine, the leaders of the Quad Alliance, that's the leaders of India, the United States, Australia and Japan, are virtually meeting this evening. And this meeting comes in the midst of this invasion. India is the only country in this grouping that has not condemned Russia's action in Ukraine. And there is incredibly a report today that was published in the US media that the United States actually recalled a cable that it had sent to its diplomats, which said that India and the UAE were in Russia's camp because of the positions that they have taken at the United Nations and different platforms of the UN. Meanwhile, a US official has also said today that the Americans are still deciding on whether or not to impose sanctions on India for the purchase of a missile defense system from Russia. Last night, India abstained again at a UN vote that condemned Russia, and there is a UN Human Rights Council meeting that's also taking place. India has spoken there today, talking about the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The vote there is tomorrow. We'll have to wait and see if there is any shift at all. But at the moment, the question is, how is that Quad meeting going, given the very different stand that India has taken from the rest of its friends in that alliance? Well, joining us this evening, here in the studio with us, defense analyst Ajay Shukla. We have Tanvi Madan from Brookings joining us from Washington this evening, and Glenn Carl, who's worked with the CIA and is an author and columnist. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us. Tanvi Madan, you follow the Quad, its meetings, its implications very, very closely. How do you think it may have gone given the circumstances?
I think part of it is just the fact of the meeting itself. It wasn't a scheduled meeting. It is not one of the regular meetings. We expected the leaders to meet next in sometimes later this spring or early summer. I think part of the fact of the meeting itself is signaling, both for India and for the US. I think for India, as this image was catching on, that India wasn't kind of striking a balance, walking a tightrope, sitting on the fence, choose your metaphor. That it was actually going over into the Russian camp, enabling Russian actions. A pro-Russian neutrality is what one person said to me. To correct this impression and to say that, look, we are not going back to the Cold War. That this is not India going into the Soviet/Russian camp again. And you've seen a few other moves from the government, including pushing back on some of the Russian points about, Ukraine's taking hostages, etc. And this is unusual, since India usually doesn't contradict Russian statements. But I think the other thing is, for the US, this is a signaling device to say, we are not forgetting the Indo-Pacific. They also did this with sending a high-level delegation to Taiwan a few days ago to point out that they aren't kind of, just focused on Europe, and the Indo-Pacific theater is going to be forgotten. If anything, they've been pointing out, including in their statement about the Quad meeting today, that the two theaters are connected and have what happens in one area will not stay in that area. So I think there are multiple things, and plus the Quad meeting will give these four leaders. There's nothing written in the kind of Quad, there's no treaty, but there's no understanding that the Quad has to agree on everything. They agree on a certain set of issues. Those have to do with the Indo-Pacific, but they aren't aligned on Russia. We've always known that. That's not new. But this will give them an opportunity to have a frank and blunt conversation about what's going on and the implications for the Indo-Pacific as well.
Glenn Carl, how blunt do you think that conversation would be? As I was just pointing out, there's an extraordinary story about the US State Department recalling a cable to its diplomats. I'm just reading out to you the contents of that cable. It said that, continuing to call for dialogue, as you've been doing in the Security Council, is not a stand of neutrality. It places you in Russia's camp, the aggressor in this conflict. So is that increasingly how the American administration is seeing this? Or, do they understand India's compulsions at the end of the day with its relationship with Russia?
But in a diplomatic meeting, it would be very unusual for there to be harsh or blunt talk. And even if someone is trying to indirect ways, such as it would be unfortunate if one had to do X or Y rather than one failing us and we're going to come and twist your arm now. So formally, I don't think that would happen. The cables themselves, the assessments internally in the government are more frank. I do think that the message will be conveyed that the first priority of the Quad is security for the Pacific and relations with regard to maritime freedom movement, but that India's position is from an earlier era and doesn't really serve India either. And in this instance of all, we have almost like videos in a trial of rape, and yet one says, well, gosh, the person who's accused has been my friend, and so I don't know. It's a stark situation, and I think India's position, which has been evolving in the last 15 years, will continue to, but needs to perhaps evolve a little bit more. This instance.
Right. Ajay Shukla, let me get you in here. How do you see India's dilemma, Ajay Shukla? And sort of given the concerns, we already know that Moscow has a good relationship with China. But is there a danger that as Moscow gets more and more isolated by the West, that will drive President Putin further towards President Xi? And therefore, what are the consequences for us?
Nidhi, the thing that has to be kept in mind is that Russia is not without an argument over here. Russia is doing what it is doing for a reason that has directly to do with its national security. It believes that NATO's presence on its borders is not healthy for it. It's something that impinges on their security. And therefore, when a country like India, with a long history of debt to the Soviet Union, and many instances where the Soviet Union diplomatically supported India in the UN Security Council, it is not so difficult from the desk of the Indian Foreign Secretary to see that it has a role to play in ensuring that Russia does not get completely isolated. So that, I think, is something that is not going to go away. You are not going to see India turn its back on Russia, regardless of the relationship with Xi Jinping, regardless of the fact that India is in a way voting against its own interests. But that's the way the game is playing out. Russia, this sort of is nowhere near achieving its sort of conflict termination aims. So this is something that's going to go on for some time, and India is going to have to find a way of just making this sound less and less unattractive.
Tanvi Madan, just coming back to you on India's choices going forward, how long do you think India can afford to keep abstaining, or is it just going to keep doing that, keeping its own interests in mind?
The abstentions, this is not the first time India is abstaining, and their real interests beyond, I actually don't think it's kind of historical gratitude as much. India has done enough for Russia as well. I think it's very pragmatic concerns, including about continuing dependence on Russian military parts and supplies, as Ajay knows and can tell us better than I can, as well as the fact that needing to get Indian students and other nationals out, and so wanting to keep that line open. But I think even the Indian government, whatever thinks about Russia having security concerns, even for the Indian government, the reasons they've talked about territorial integrity and sovereignties, India can't be seen, including for its own interests, not for the US, not for the Europeans, for its own interests. India cannot be seen as endorsing the idea that if you have security interests, the way to solve them is by invading another country or using force. After all, that's the exact argument China makes about what it's done at the border, that we had security interest and so we grabbed this piece of territory. And this was, and they say the same thing, historical rights, ethnic linkages. So India has to be careful about that. But it will, I agree, it is not going to give up the Russia relationship. It has little desire to do so. But I think there is also an understanding, and you've seen it, I think, in the last couple of days, that at the end of the day, while wanting to preserve the Russia option, the option for India that's been growing in terms of a balancing strategy vis-a-vis China is with kind of these other like-minded partners on China, the US, some European countries, especially France, as well as Australia and Japan. And so I think India will continue to do what it has done. But I do think you will see some efforts, we'll see about implementation to continue to kind of reinforce this Indian desire to both produce indigenously defense equipment and diversify, partly because you are seeing the constraints. While we talk about strategic autonomy, now you're seeing how dependence on Russia, not the West, is constraining India's ability to say or not abstain, as it might have done in the past, or frankly, much earlier in the crisis, reiterated its belief in territorial integrity and sovereignty. So I don't expect the balancing act to stop. I think you might see some differences in gradations and emphasis, but I would also say some of this, I would caveat this with, things are going to get much worse on the ground, as General Huda said, and that could potentially see India make some adjustments, but especially in terms of attacks on civilians and what's happening, I think things will get worse.
I think you're right, and we're seeing that nuance in language and tone. For instance, in the way India rebutted the Kremlin statement on Indian students being taken hostage, or even when they've talked about the humanitarian crisis. Ajay, just a last quick comment from you then. As Tanvi Madan was mentioning there, when you're talking about the principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, India also is the world's largest democracy. And one has to ask, do principles, morals, do they matter at all in foreign policy and real politics?
You're asking me, Nidhi?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that while I largely agree with a lot that Tanvi has said, I think that sometimes we get taken away by our own beliefs and positions, and that happens most often when we're dealing with Russia. So I think that Russia is adhering to a certain foreign policy code and a sort of military tradition that has sort of the historical experience of being invaded at least 3 times in the last 3 centuries by sort of Western European powers, and that's something that coalesces and condenses into a certain foreign policy and a way of looking at its borders with Europe, and Russia is acting entirely in conformity with the way that it's done it all these years. Starting from the collapse of the Soviet Union in the late 1980s, it has been steadily resisting the ingress or the Western, I should say, Eastern move of NATO, and to no avail. NATO has continued to move east. So I think that regardless of the basic principles of democracy and of sort of respect for borders and so on, Russia sort of places its own security interests on a higher plane, and that's what is guiding it in its current sort of move into Ukraine, and that is something which is not going to change in a hurry.
Well, thank you very much to all of you for giving some perspective on that big story. Clearly, the next few days are going to be brutal. That's pretty clear now as the Russian forces advance towards other big cities in Ukraine. Thank you very much. And finally, tonight, as Russia faces a series of unprecedented and coordinated sanctions by the West, those hurt the most at the moment appear to be Russia's rich and powerful oligarchs, their big billionaires who are close to Putin. Their planes, ships and homes are now in danger of being snatched away, and even their football clubs. One of the oligarchs, Roman Abramovich, is selling the soccer club Chelsea in an effort to shed his assets. Now, in his State of the Union address this week, President Biden warned Russia's billionaires that we're coming to seize your yachts, your luxury apartments and your private jets. And clearly worried, the super rich Russians have now started running. According to reports today, at least 4 super yachts owned by these Russian billionaires were spotted moving towards Montenegro and the Maldives. The other assets which could be seized potentially are their properties in the UK. The UK government is said to be drawing up plans which will hit 9 oligarchs, including Russia's youngest billionaire, who's also Putin's former son-in-law. The Guardian has reported that some of the oligarchs who are under sanctions have been linked to nearly £200 million of property in and around London. One of them, Peter Aven, who is the main shareholder in Russia's largest private bank, he has an £8 million house in London, with a massive art collection, while another one, Mikhail Friedman, a financier, purchased a property in London for £65 million back in 2016. And in more bad news for the rich guys, even tax havens are freezing the assets of Russia's billionaires. Monaco has already done it, and that's why some of them are trying to move their money to other places. The sanctions also include travel bans to Europe and to the US, and there are reports now that President Biden will be announcing more sanctions against them later today. Under pressure, some of these oligarchs have now started speaking out against the war in Ukraine. And that's it on No Spin tonight. Thanks for watching.